Okay, this video is on a review of the homework, but first I wanted to talk a little bit about some things at the end of the chapter. Um, First off, and I've written on the board here, the idea of the linkages of monetary policy. How does monetary policy affect the GDP? And you're going to be asked to draw out, to literally and sometimes in an answer, literally do what I've done on the board here, make this chain effect of how monetary policy works. So during a recession, we need expansionary monetary policy. That's what's going on right now in 2020. Open market operations, the Fed would buy bonds from banks. It would induce banks to sell their bonds to the Fed. The Fed would buy them by offering a very high price for them, offering $11,000, $12,000, $13,000 for a $10,000 bond. That will put money into the reserves of the banks, give banks money to put into their reserves. An increase in excess reserves means an increase in the money supply. Okay. And your book talks about the federal funds rate being in the middle of that. An increase in excess reserves reduces the federal funds rate. The federal funds rate is almost always near zero right now anyway, and it's kind of out of the loop now. The most important thing is that it increases the money supply by encouraging banks to lend more money. That reduces interest rates. Notice I've changed to writing the small I because that's what your book is doing now. Interest rates are down. Nominal, real, it's the same thing at this point. If interest rates are down, investment spending is up. That is a component of aggregate demand. Okay, investment spending is a component of aggregate demand. If investment spending is up, aggregate demand is up, and that's going to push up GDP. Might cause some inflation, but when we're in a deep recession, it won't cause much inflation because we'll be sliding along that horizontal portion of the aggregate supply curve. The reverse of all that is true in an inflationary time. We need restrictive, which is the same thing as contractionary fiscal policy, monetary policy. In open market operations, the Fed would be selling bonds. How does it make banks buy the bonds from them? The Fed is trying to sell these bonds, and it does that by offering to sell them at very low prices. $7,000, $8,000 for a $10,000 bond. Banks are going to want to buy those up. They have to give their cash on reserve, their reserves to the Fed to do that. It reduces the amount of excess reserves, reduces the money supply. The federal funds rate would be in between there in the period before 2008. Nowadays, that doesn't matter anymore. It increases the interest rate because money's hard to get now. This is a tight money policy here during inflationary times. Interest rates begin to rise. They go up to 5, 6, 7, 10, 11, 12% sometimes. That reduces the amount of investment, which is a component of aggregate demand. And when aggregate demand goes down and shifts to the left, that's going to reduce GDP and reduce the rate of inflation. Or eliminate inflation altogether, we would hope. All right, so I just wanted to go through those linkages. They are on page 733 in your textbook, okay? And then when you turn to the next page, 734 and 735, you see the impact on the aggregate demand, aggregate supply curves. So on the left-hand side, page 734, we have the money market, the supply of money shifting to the right or to the left. We have the investment demand curve, interest rates going up or going down, which will either increase or decrease the amount of business investment, depending on whether we're in a recession or an inflationary time. And then the impact on the ADAS graph on page 735. Make sure you understand all that. The evaluation of monetary policy. So we went through an evaluation of fiscal policy back in the earlier unit. This time, the evaluation of monetary policy. Monetary policy also has some lags. However, it has been very effective in being a quicker alternative to fiscal policy. Fiscal policy requires the president and Congress to sit down, talk about things, form committees, get testimony, debate the issues, write up a bill, pass it, and then the president decide whether he's going to sign it or not. And that can take weeks, months. Monetary policy is decided by the 7 members of the Federal Reserve Board, sometimes in conjunction with the Federal Open Market Committee, which is a very small number of people. They can literally meet in the morning, decide, take their votes, and by afternoon, the word is out to the rest of the Federal Reserve banks about what they're going to do. And the New York Fed is the one who actually does the open market operations. All that is done through the New York branch of the Federal Reserve, the New York Federal Reserve. And that can be done later that afternoon. They're already either buying or selling bonds, depending on what the decision of the Board of Governors is. So monetary policy can be put into action with lightning speed, very, very quickly. There's very, very little lag. The lag would be the recognition lag. When do the Board of Governors realize that there's a problem and they need to take action? And that can be several weeks or a month into it based on economic data that comes into them. Monetary policy has proven to be very effective in limiting inflation. So this bottom line here, when we have inflation and we need to slow the economy down, monetary policy has been proven to be pretty effective during that if you look back in history. Monetary policy's impact on expanding an economy that's in recession has been much more difficult because of the concept of the liquidity trap. Is one of your homework questions. We're going to cover that in a few minutes. The idea that the Federal Reserve can create a lot of excess reserves for banks, and the banks should be lending that out. They don't have to. They can sit on those excess reserves and not lend them out, and interest rates can drop to near zero, and they still won't lend that money out. And so the expansionary monetary policy has been less effective than contractionary or restrictive monetary policy. All right, some homework questions. We'll probably wind up having to do 2 videos here. I'll get the first couple of homework questions and then I'll stop and make a second video. What is the basic determinant of the transactions demand? Looking at your homework, you know it's the nominal GDP, the size of the GDP. That's the transactions demand. Remember that transactions demand, so this is homework question number 1. This is the money market. This is the interest rate, and this is the money supply, and the transactions demand is the distance we are to the right. So we're just going to put a dot there. We're that far to the right. That's the transactions demand, that amount right there. And then the asset demand is dependent on the interest rate, and that gives us the total demand for money. So the transactions demand, the asset demand, and the total demand for money is drawn on the board there. On a graph, explain the 2 demands graphically. We just did use a graph to show the impact of an increase in the total demand for money on the equilibrium interest rate. So if we start off with the supply of money right here and the equilibrium interest rate right there, I1, and then we have an expansion of the demand for money. Suddenly, for some reason, maybe the transactions demand shifts to the right, maybe the asset demand becomes a little flatter. Let's say the transactions demand shifts to the right, and we get a new D prime demand for money. We're going to wind up with a shortage. That much is demanded at the old interest rate. We're going to have a big shortage of money if the money supply doesn't go anywhere. That's going to drive interest rates up. So we won't go here because interest rates will be driven up by people wanting to get a hold of that money. So there's interest rate number 2. So that should be drawn in your homework. Use your knowledge of equilibrium prices to explain why the previous interest rate is no longer sustainable, because we get a huge shortage of funds that are being demanded there. People who want loans can't get them. They're willing to pay higher price, a higher interest rate for their loans. Number two, what is the basic objective of monetary policy? What are the major strengths of monetary policy? Why is monetary policy easier to conduct than fiscal policy? So the objective of monetary policy is, quote, to assist the economy in achieving a full employment, non-inflationary level of total output. So it's to get the economy back to full employment. The major strengths of monetary policy are its speed and flexibility compared to fiscal policy. The Board of Governors is removed from political pressure, so they don't have a constituency yelling at them about anything. It's been successful in preventing inflation and keeping prices stable over time. And what was the last part of the question there? Why is monetary policy easier than fiscal policy? Because it's just the 7 Board of Governors and not the President and Congress. So I'm going to stop the video here and we'll pick it up with homework question number 3 in the next video.